in our last session of two more papers. Our next speaker is Samantha Rigante, and her thesis is entitled On the Moral Responsibility, Evil, and Punishment of Adolf Eichmann and its Moral Implications for Us.
Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Hi, my name is Samantha Rigante. As Professor Tessman mentioned, my thesis is entitled On the Moral Responsibility, Evil, and Punishment of Adolf Eichmann and its Moral Implications for Us. I want to thank the faculty, jury, and everyone for being here today before I begin. So, table of contents for how this presentation is structured. First, I'll give an introduction into who Adolf Eichmann is, and also into the guiding questions that I'm researching throughout this thesis. Next, I'll discuss a theory of evil, a specific definition, and how we can apply it to Eichmann. Then I'll discuss Eichmann's moral responsibility. After that, I'll discuss the concepts of desert and desert-based retributivism. Then I will answer the question, what does Eichmann deserve? And finally, I will be discussing Eichmann's punishment. So, again, introduction, who is Adolf Eichmann? Adolf Eichmann was an officer in the SS in Nazi Germany during World War II, and his role was basically focused on deporting and transporting people to concentration camps. So throughout, from 1940 to 1945, he sent millions of people to concentration camps and ultimately to their deaths. Once the war ended, he escaped to Argentina, where he lived for about 15 years until the Mossad, which is the Israeli equivalent of the CIA essentially, found out where he was, brought him back to Israel, put him on trial, and eventually executed him for crimes against humanity and crimes against the Jewish people. So the questions that I'm answering throughout this thesis, the first one that is guiding my research is, was Eichmann evil? And in order to answer this question, I will be applying Claudia Card's theory of evil that she uses in her work, The Atrocity Paradigm, and I'll see how we can fit it to Eichmann. Then I will answer the question, can he be held morally responsible? If Eichmann can indeed be held morally responsible, I will answer the question, finally, what does Eichmann deserve after all of this? And throughout this presentation, I will answer these questions, and I will have proven that Eichmann is evil, morally responsible, and deserves something by way of punishment. So again, the theory of evil that I'm using comes from Claudia Card's work, The Atrocity Paradigm. I'm going to read this quote out loud, so everybody can read along with me. It's her definition of evil, and then I'll explain it in my words. So she says, evils are foreseeable harms produced by culpable wrongdoing. On my theory, the nature and severity of the harms, rather than the perpetrator's psychological states, distinguish evils from ordinary wrongs. Evildoers may not be evil people, although they may become so over time. So essentially what Card is saying here is that an evil, so an evil action, at least in this definition, is a predictable harm that a rationally acting agent would notice if they were acting with reasonable care. And what distinguishes her theory of evil from others is that she is unconcerned with, again, perpetrator psychological states, or what I'm going to call motive. She's not interested in that. That's what makes something evil. She's concerned with the gravity of the harm itself, and she says that that is what makes something evil. Again, also in that last sentence, she distinguishes between this idea of an evildoer and an evil person, and in the next slide, I'll explain that distinction and how someone can do evil but not necessarily be an evil person. So what makes someone evil? There's 4 things, and I'm going to go through all of them, so let's start at the top. And the first thing is this idea of intention. So an intention is someone's conscious objective or purpose when acting. And for example, if I steal bread from a store, my intention is to do something wrong vis-a-vis stealing this bread. My goal is to break the law by stealing this bread. And so in Card's conception, what makes something an evil intention is when someone's aim, their intended goal, their intention, is to do someone else foreseeable harm. And so that's when an intention becomes evil. This is different than motive, and motive is someone's reason for acting. So back to the bread example, if I steal bread, my motive may be that I was hungry or poor and I couldn't eat and that's why I'm stealing the bread, and again, that's different than my intention. An evil motive in Card's conception is when someone's reason for acting, if occurred, would bring harm to someone else. So an evil motive would be, if I hated the store owner and wanted to make him lose money by stealing bread, that would be an evil intention. And again, an evil motive, sorry. And again, that's different than a motive that wasn't evil, like me being poor or hungry. What this culminates in is the idea of an evil deed. And an evil deed is when someone's evil intention, again, their aim when acting, succeeds. So when they successfully make their evil intention happen, when they act, then it becomes an evil deed. And culpability is just this idea of something being morally blameworthy. So someone is thus evil if their intentions are evil and also morally blameworthy. And this distinction between evil doer and evil person arises. So an evil doer is somebody who does an evil deed, and an evil person is someone whose repeated, persistent, and effective intentions are evil. So if someone just does an evil deed once, it doesn't necessarily make them an evil person. And there's also this idea that, you know, someone's intentions when they're acting, again, may not be evil. So if someone was brainwashed into believing something and then they did an evil deed, their intentions might not be evil. Their intention might be to show loyalty to some superior, and that's their intention. So again, even though they're doing something evil at the end, their intentions are not evil. There's also something else that's important in Card's theory, and this is the idea that evil intenders may not foresee harm, and there's a few ways that this can happen. But one of them is by being reckless in action. So if you know something will probably cause harm, but you just don't care and you continue to do it anyway, that's being reckless. That can be evil, even if you're not like foreseeing it at the end. And you can also be evil by ignoring what is occurring and trying to sort of close yourself off. But you can still have evil intentions with all of these things. So Card actually mentions Eichmann in her theory of evil, and she says, someone may be rightly judged an evil person on the basis of persistent and effective evil motives or intentions, or on the basis of persistent gross negligence or recklessness. Adolf Eichmann is rightly judged an evil man on the basis of his persistent and effective evil intentions, regardless of the banality of his motives. So she is saying, and I agree, that Eichmann is evil because his persistent and effective intentions were to send millions of people to their deaths through his work. His aim when acting was to bring about intolerable harm to millions of people. Again, Card is not necessarily in her situation concerned with this idea of motive. It's not necessary to her to determine whether or not Eichmann is evil. Eichmann is evil to her regardless. And I agree with that, but I would like to go a little further than that and argue that not only are Eichmann's intentions evil, but his motives are evil as well. So I've discussed this idea of Eichmann being evil according to Card's conception, and now in order to hold him responsible, we have to determine his moral agency and his moral responsibility. So what is a moral agent? A moral agent is someone who knows the difference between right and wrong. So children and animals are, not in our conception at least, considered to be moral agents. For example, if a 4-year-old child accidentally breaks the TV, we can't hold him responsible necessarily because he didn't know that it was wrong, right? Like the 5-year-old child isn't acting in a way that he's rationally conceiving that breaking this TV is wrong, even though I know it's wrong. So moral responsibility comes about, and that's when someone knows the difference between right and wrong, and then, based on their acting morally right or wrong, is deserving of something. And so someone can be held morally responsible if they act voluntarily, out of free will, and are not coerced. And again, someone who is not a moral agent cannot be held morally responsible. There's also this interesting perspective that I want to point out that some evil people actually may not be moral agents because they are unable to inherently understand moral norms as rational people would. And so with all of this, determining what, if anything, Eichmann deserves is based on this idea of him being morally responsible. When Eichmann was put on trial in 1961, and Hannah Arendt wrote Eichmann in Jerusalem, the typical view of Eichmann at that time was he was viewed as someone whose faults lied in his inability to question, his adherence to order, and overall a lack of initiative. And so there was sort of this idea that Eichmann and other Nazis existed in a world where it was, impossible to question Hitler. Hitler was always right, and what they considered to be right was not what we consider morally right or wrong, but instead what Hitler said was right or wrong. Eichmann at his trial described himself as a cog in the machine of Hitler's regime, and a few days before his death sentence was read out, he said, "I am not the monster I am made out to be. I am the victim of a fallacy." And he believed this truly, and he thought that his fallacy was believing in Hitler's lies, not anything else that he had actually done. And so if this view of Eichmann is correct, then this is someone whom we cannot hold morally responsible, because he did not do the moral work necessary to determine what was right versus what was wrong. I also want to note that, obviously, we cannot hold Eichmann responsible for his failure to stop the Nazi regime. That would have been overall impossible. But this typical view of Eichmann is not the real Eichmann. And throughout the rest of this presentation, I will show both his moral agency and his moral responsibility. So Adolf Eichmann was born in Germany and grew up in Austria. And when the Nazi Party was rising to prominence in 1933 when he joined, we can say that he joined for at least relatively at that time mundane reasons. Part of this was wanting to restore Germany to some former glory after its embarrassing loss in World War I. Some of this was wanting to curb the threat of communism that was spreading around Europe. And anti-Semitism was obviously a part of it, but it was not Eichmann's motive for joining, and his intention at that time was certainly not to become the exterminator of the Jews. And it's also interesting to note that Eichmann was not pushed into this by family members or anybody else. His fiancée at the time actually disagreed with him about his decision to join the party and made derogatory comments about his doing so. And so when he joined again, he was motivated by nationalistic intentions. His early work in the Nazi Party was devoted to a segment that worked on something called Jewish affairs. And so within this role, he learned everything he could about the Jewish people. He learned Yiddish. He tried to learn Hebrew. He actually wanted to have the Nazis pay for a tutoring session for him with a rabbi. When they obviously said no to this, he was embarrassed that he hadn't just had the rabbi arrested in the first place. And so through this, we can see that his intentions are slowly becoming worse over time, and there's a shift in his thinking and disregard for the Jews. But again, he was still not considered to be somebody who was a potential exterminator of the Jewish people. William Hodel, another SD, that's the Nazi security service at the time, somebody who worked beside Eichmann in Vienna, said that Eichmann was somebody who he saw as obsessed with the Jewish question, but not a potential exterminator of the Jewish people. And throughout the 1930s into the 1940s, anti-Semitism obviously rose within Germany. And despite this, Eichmann made the rational choice. He made the decision to stay in and rise up in the ranks of the Nazi Party. And I'm going to skip to 1941 now, so the war has broken out. And Eichmann is now in charge of deporting and transporting people to concentration camps. And I'd also like to note that at this time, the final solution, the directive to exterminate the Jewish people, was not made formal policy. But that being said, Eichmann did know the order for it because he was of a high enough level where that was something that he was aware was happening and going to be made formal policy. And so, as part of his duties, Eichmann traveled to Treblinka, to Pell, to Auschwitz, which are all concentration camps, and he also went to the city of Minsk. And he saw really horrible things. When he went to Auschwitz, Rudolf Haas, the commandant of Auschwitz, noted that he thought Eichmann's uneasiness at seeing people tortured at the camp was funny. Eichmann saw Jews being brutalized and thrown and shot into a pit in Minsk, and he saw what would eventually become the Treblinka gas chambers. Eichmann actually recounted at his trial, and this was about the Jews being thrown into the pit in Minsk. He said, "Then I saw the most horrible sight I had thus far seen in my life. And then I was off, jumped into my car, and did not open my mouth anymore. I refused to do it. I could not. I had to disappear." He also recalls how he had nightmares after this whole experience. And so once this traveling was over, he returned back to Berlin to continue working at his role, which was really organizing like the transportation and the timetables and the cars and making sure that people were being sent where they were supposed to go in the concentration camps. He returned to Berlin and he went to his supervisor, Heinrich Müller. And he told Müller, "There is no solution to the Jewish question, and besides, we're training our men to be sadists. And so this exemplifies Eichmann's moral responsibility. He returned from Minsk to tell his supervisor that there was no solution to the Jewish question and that the mass extermination of people was not necessary or correct. And that if it continued, the Nazi men and soldiers forced to commit such acts were going to become evil people and sadists. And so knowing all of this, however, he stayed. We can see here that Eichmann was not initially someone who thought that the physical annihilation of Jews was the right answer to the Jewish question, no matter how much he disregarded them. Yet he recognized what was occurring and understood what his role would entail when he returned to Berlin. And so he completely disregarded the moral feelings that this was wrong, and he continued to do his work with enthusiasm. What is important is that Eichmann had moral knowledge to know that the final solution was mistaken, and to relate this to others, to his supervisor, and then to decide to remain within the system as not merely an accomplice or a cog in the machine, but a willing part of it. He believed that this evilness was wrong, and in not intervening or leaving, made the decision to justify it. Thus, this is someone whom we can hold morally responsible for his actions, despite his later claims. I also don't want to overstate Eichmann's role. He was absolutely significant. He wasn't necessarily a policymaker. He had some leeway within the orders he was given, and he was of a higher status than most soldiers, but he wasn't somebody who made policy. I'd also like to talk about a potential objection now that might be arising, and this is the idea that maybe Eichmann was unable to leave his role because of brainwashing or a threat to his life, but this simply isn't true. Again, we can see that Eichmann wasn't brainwashed. He saw these horrible things, he felt that it was wrong, and he told his supervisor that it was wrong, and yet he continued to do it anyway. He also remarked at the trial that people actually requested transfers to different stations all the time with no threat to their lives or livelihood. So again, this is not a reason for Eichmann to have stayed within his role. At some point throughout the war, his motives became evil as well. In 1943, Rudolf Haas, the commandant of Auschwitz again, remarked how Eichmann was now obsessed with this idea of destroying the Jews. And this continued until 1957. When Eichmann was interviewed by a Dutch Nazi sympathizer journalist in Argentina, he said, "No, I have no regrets. Every fiber in me resists that we did something wrong. I must tell you honestly, had we killed 10.3 million Jews, then I would be satisfied and say, good, we have exterminated an enemy. That is the truth. Why should I deny it?" And so we can see here that Eichmann is evil not only because of his persistent and effective evil intentions to send millions of people to their death, but because of his motives as well. His reasoning is now that of someone who is evil. We can also see Eichmann's evil through comparing him to other Nazis. So this is Albert Speer, who was the Minister of Armaments and War Production in Nazi Germany. And he's mentioned in Diana Jeski's book, The Evil Within, where she says that Albert Speer avoided forming moral beliefs about the atrocities being committed by the Third Reich. Speer closed himself off, and he did not ask questions about where these weapons and armaments under his production were going, or how they were being used. And in a quote, he actually says, "I did not investigate, for I did not want to know what was happening at Auschwitz. From that moment on, I was inescapably contaminated morally. From fear of discovering something which may have made me turn my course, I had closed my eyes." And this is a clear contrast to Eichmann, because Speer never visited the concentration camps or saw the sites that Eichmann did. And so he's opposed to Eichmann, who did put his moral knowledge to the test, unlike Speer. Now I want to note that Speer is still evil, and we can refer back to Card's theory where people can be evil even if they don't foresee harm necessarily. So Speer is evil through what she would call choosing to ignore, because Speer literally chose to ignore what was happening. But this is different than Eichmann's evil, because Eichmann's evil lies in his intentions, his motives, and his moral responsibility. So now that I've discussed this idea of Eichmann's evil and moral responsibility, I'm going to move on to theories of punishment. And before I jump into this idea of desert and desert-based retributivism, I'm going to discuss consequentialism, which is another theory that can be used to justify punishment. So under consequentialism, basically the idea is that punishment is good if it has good consequences. And so what we usually think of is this idea of deterrence, where somebody sees somebody else be punished for a crime and they decide they don't want to do it anymore because they don't want to be punished. And that raises the overall level of good in a society. And so That's great, but in Eichmann's case especially, consequentialism fails immediately. There is no deterrent effect that happened with Eichmann's execution. We can look at genocide that happened after Eichmann was executed. I'm thinking of the Cambodian genocide with Pol Pot, which happened in the 1970s. Joseph Stalin and the USSR politically repressed and killed millions of people for years before and after the Holocaust. And there's even more examples of where Eichmann's execution had little to no deterrent effect, especially when we're discussing people of such evil. There's also this idea that Eichmann's execution may have actually had unintended negative consequences. There's a quote from Gershom Scholem, who was an Israeli German philosopher, and he wrote to Hannah Arendt after her publication of Eichmann in Jerusalem. And Scholem said that he felt that Eichmann's execution may have actually served to alleviate the guilt of some Nazis and Nazi sympathizers, and that beyond that, it may have made it seem like something, in this case the Holocaust, had been atoned for, yet there was no atonement for something of such evil. So again, consequentialism fails, and I will be moving on to the theory of desert and desert-based retributism. Well, what is desert? I've mentioned the word a lot. Well, desert is this really intuitive idea that we believe that if someone is a good person or does good actions in their life, that they deserve to live well and have good things happen to them as a result, or vice versa. And so Eichmann, in the context of his actions and deeds and moral responsibility, deserves something. And along those same lines, there's a theory of punishment, desert-based retributism, which argues that punishing people is morally permissible because they did something wrong and they deserve it. And it's most appropriate when discussing evilness and moral responsibility because it takes into consideration what one deserves in the context of their actions. And so Eichmann deserves a specific kind and severity of punishment correlated to the wrong that he committed. And this can only accurately be generated via desert-based retributivism. Desert requires that we punish someone as they deserve, not merely punishing for the sake of punishment. And desert-based retributivism works in justifying punishments for, at least according to Eichmann's scale of evil, more mundane crimes. We can think of something like robbery, or even crimes of much more evil, but those still less than Eichmann's evil, like murder or kidnapping. So we intuitively feel like a murderer deserves to be punished to a great extent. Some may say execution, some may say life imprisonment. Regardless, the idea is that a murderer, we feel, deserves to be executed, or deserves punishment, and that makes sense. And that a robber should also be punished by serving some jail sentence correlated to the level of crime he committed seems to accurately reflect our intuitions of desert. And so again, it feels to be the most proper punishment theory when dealing with such a grand scale of crimes and evil, because we are horrified by Eichmann's crimes because of the moral impermissibility, and even more so because of his moral responsibility. We want to punish him, and it is this feeling, this intuition, that because of his actions and his moral responsibility, he deserves this punishment. However, this is where desert-based retributivism begins to fail. Again, we have these ideas of crimes of less evil and how these people deserve punishments. And these are punishments that we can accurately hand out with what we are able to do on Earth, and that matches our intuitions. But to say that Eichmann, who oversaw and sent millions of people to their deaths, deserves the same punishment as others whose crimes and scale of evil is far less, seems really misguided. Eichmann is evil and morally responsible for his actions, and we must determine his punishment accordingly. Eichmann's crime is unique because it occurred on such a massive scale, and he can be held morally responsible, something virtually unseen until the Holocaust. What began as moral complacency with anti-Semitism in the Nazi regime became his discomfort with the final solution, but his decision to continue working. And so these facets of his crime combined to make what Eichmann deserves extraordinary. His evil was of colossal dimensions. Eichmann is morally responsible for consciously continuing in this role and deporting millions of people to their deaths. And so he deserves an exceptional punishment for this, rather than execution or life imprisonment. Again, these punishments are afforded to crimes of far less evil that are nowhere near the level of desert that Eichmann is answerable for. An ordinary punishment simply will not fit in the extraordinary crime. And this is where the problem lies, because any morally justified punishment that we can dispense is too unremarkable, whereas anything Eichmann deserves is morally reprehensible. Eichmann might deserve to go on a cattle car. He deserves to see how his actions affected people. We can say maybe he deserves to see photos and videos of how people were really affected during the Holocaust. Maybe he deserves to be sentenced to hard labor. But regardless, the precise punishment that desert-based retributivism would generate for Eichmann would be an impermissible evil, whether psychological or physical. And so I'm using this idea of torture, and torture is something that, again, we think of as a morally impermissible punishment, something horrible that we can't do to people. But that's merely an example of a morally impermissible punishment that Eichmann would deserve. And there are some legally permissible punishments that are also morally prohibited. Where that line falls is unclear, like some believe execution is also an example of a morally impermissible punishment. But regardless of the validity of this claim, the point remains that whatever Eichmann deserved, it was not something that morally acting humans could possibly administer. I'd like to take a step back from the theory of punishments and go to a little bit of legal. So I'm trying to ask the question, should Eichmann have actually gone unpunished? Not necessarily. If Israel's arguments and standard of proof for Eichmann's crimes culminated in execution under a legal definition, then Israel had the legal right to execute him. The law does not necessarily have to reflect our moral intuitions, and these can remain separate institutions deeming different punishments acceptable. Morally, however, no punishment given to him could be both what he deserves and permissible, because any punishment would either be out of our proportion by being too little, or to constitute torture, which would violate our moral values. Execution is, to some at least, the worst punishment we can get, and it's still not really bad enough. It's not deserving enough of Eichmann's level of crime. And we have this inclination to punish at any rate that creates the desire to punish Eichmann with anything, something undeserving of his crimes. Our retributive dispositions desperately want us to punish Eichmann in the way he deserves, and the fact that we can't do this feels really disappointing. But there's no way to absolve this fact, and for Eichmann's evil and knowledge of this harm, he absolutely deserved such an evil punishment. But torture or anything else of such impermissible evil is one of the worst things a person can undertake, especially towards another. And it's not okay, even if Eichmann deserves it. Because torturing others brutalizes those being forced to undertake it. And once sanctioned, becomes something more permissible within the society as a whole. This overall effect leads to overwhelming cruelty and a denigration of our commitment to respecting others, kindness, and a human desire not to harm others. In fact, this is why we are so horrified when we see the Nazi genocide. Nazi law broke every important human value, every innate kindness that we hold towards each other, and that is exactly why we regard it as one of the most evil things that could occur. It is the fact that many Nazis, especially Eichmann, knew that what they were doing was wrong and yet continued on, becoming morally responsible, evil, and losing whatever humanity they may have had. To do so, to punish Eichmann in this way, would also be to lose our humanity, to lose those same human values, and to become so caught up in the idea of punishment that what must be repaired and valued can no longer be seen. Our retributive inclinations occasionally need to go unsatisfied, and this is one of those times. I feel, and I'm sure a lot of other people feel, that it is unsatisfactory to say that we should not be punishing Eichmann, but to lose our humanity through torture, through the inhumane punishment that Eichmann deserves, is simply morally impermissible. And it may feel more satisfactory to get retribution, but we are not stooping down to Eichmann's level in this way. To punish Eichmann in the way that he truly deserves would be to become evil ourselves. To retain our humanity is a far greater feat. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really important subject, and we appreciate the way that you were bringing out different aspects of moral responsibility. I had some questions about right at the end, you were the consequentialist and desert-based ideas about punishment. With the consequentialist part of that, I was wondering, you were talking about how
think what's important when discussing like consequentialist punishment is that it's not only deterrence, because I agree, I think the deterrent effect, luckily there's not so many mass murderers, and that whatever effect it did have as far as deterrence goes may have been limited. But I think when we bring in this idea that there were also negative consequences that stem from punishment, especially justifying it under a consequentialist theory, especially when consequentialism is committed to maximizing the good. So whatever we consider to be the good, let's say I consider the good to be that, you know, people consider the Holocaust to be like bad. I guess you could say in that way that maybe consequentialism had more of an effect, but I think the point still stands that overall the intended effect of Eichmann's execution, because that was some of what the court, at least in Jerusalem, actually used to justify his execution, it didn't have the effect that they intended, and overall the negative effects were actually probably greater than the positive effects that may have stemmed from seeing Eichmann executed, because again, there was no deterrent effect, and there was a lack of good consequences, as I mentioned. There were, again, some other things like overall feeling like the Holocaust had been atoned for, and that's not something that can really be atoned for, and it gave this false sense of like, sort of maybe like we're done with dealing with this, when that wasn't at all the case. And so I think that while it definitely is true, the overall effects of justifying punishment under a consequentialist theory would still have deemed execution to not have worked for Eichmann.
So just to kind of follow up on that, you think that if execution had been the outcome, that if, you know, I don't know, life imprisonment or some other kind of form of punishment being the outcome, that in that kind of case, the sort of broader social effects would have justified punishment on consequential grounds?
No, I don't think so either. I think, again, a lot of theories of punishment run into this problem, obviously, especially when we're dealing with people of such evil like Eichmann, but I think the same things would have remained, because now that the punishment is even less so, I'm just, for the sake of right now, assuming life imprisonment is considered to be like less bad than execution, I feel like it would have had even less deterrent effect. And I think those unintended negative consequences may still have stayed, because people would have still felt like, okay, you know, Eichmann was put in jail, we can feel okay about this now. And I think the same thing happened after the Nuremberg trials, where, you know, other Nazis were put in jail and some were executed, and it was the same kind of thing. And so I think that even if we change the exact punishment, the consequences and the effects are still not great enough to justify punishment, at least under a consequentialist theory.
Okay, yeah, Andrea, you can go to the one. Yeah. So just to kind of move to the deserve-based theory, I have a similar sort of flavor of question, which is, you know, you were kind of talking about execution and sort of torture and other sort of, I guess, forms of hard treatment as punishment there. But I guess I was wondering, sort of, again, about the kind of expressive dimension of punishment. And, you know, one way of kind of like, how do you scale when it comes to kind of punishment, like levels of brutality of the hard treatment. But you could also think of levels of kind of severity of the sort of condemnation. So I mean, like, part of what we're talking about now is that, you know, rightly, Eichmann is very, very strongly condemned in the way that we sort of evaluate his actions. I wonder if that could capture some of the sort of, you talk about how ordinary punishment wouldn't capture the severity of what he did. But I wonder if there are other ways of kind of capturing that severity that might go beyond the hard treatment.
Yeah, so I think it could. There's definitely other theories of justice, not necessarily punishment, that sort of aim to get at what you're talking about. So there's theories like reconstructive justice, where the intended effect isn't really punishment, but it's more aimed at restoring the community and sort of having the offenders see how their actions have negatively impacted a community. And so there are other ways that, you know, Eichmann could have been condemned and seen how his actions affected people, but under a definition of what we consider punishment, because punishment is something that, you know, has to like intentionally inflict retributive harm on somebody. And so under that definition of punishment, I think there are other ways that we can potentially handle people like Eichmann, but under a definition of punishment, unfortunately, I don't think that works. But there are definitely things like you're talking about, again, like that reconstructive justice theory that would work at getting at something like that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
just to follow up on Rebecca's question about desert. So I wonder, because you referred to the brutalizing effects of such punishments that you kind of imagine for those who actually do the torturing, for example. So that creates a problem, because at one point you say, Eichmann or anybody in this theory deserves something, which basically means it's good if they get it, it's bad if they don't get it. At the same time, you say it's impermissible, but these two sentences seem to be in a contradiction. If they really deserve it and it's good, then how could it be impermissible? Now, one reason could be, well, it brutalizes us, right? It's not good for us, that we shouldn't do it, but oftentimes when we try to say impermissible, it means we shouldn't do it to the victim. So how would you, I mean, that's a conundrum, but how would you solve it? I mean, one solution could be, well, if we could say, if there were a God, we don't want to brutalize ourselves, but could you please go ahead, right? And then we would be fine, but I think that some of your intuitions would say, no, then we would actually think that God is acting impermissibly, but that something must be wrong. Either it's impermissible, or they deserve it. But I think you can't really say both at the same time.
Yeah, I totally understand that point. I think
at least if you say impermissibility is the interpersonal thing, right? So.
Yeah. I mean, I think Eichmann, because I think desert is sort of like a different concept than, and I know desert and punishment, obviously, they do work together, but I think that it's a different sort of thing than punishment necessarily, because I think desert is more reflected in our intuitions, and again, our intuitions aren't always right, and so, yes, we feel like Eichmann deserves this punishment, but just because we have that intuition, again, doesn't necessarily mean it's correct, because again, anything that Eichmann could be punished with would be morally impermissible. And so maybe our intuitions are wrong, and Eichmann, we feel he does deserve something, and like personally, I would say Eichmann does deserve something, but our intuitions might fail us at this point because we can't be guided by our intuitions.
Can I have another?
Yep.
The notion of moral responsibility seems to be crucial, but I thought I would have a slightly different intuition. So I think when I'm asking you questions now, I'm morally responsible for what I'm doing. I'm even responsible if I'm not doing anything wrong. I hope I don't do anything wrong. But just acting, I'm morally responsible since I'm an agent. I can actually think, and if I forget about something, we have to ask whether I was morally responsible or not. So therefore, I think Adolf is clearly morally responsible. The entire question whether Eichmann is morally responsible, it seems strange to me, actually, because your criterion seems to be, and I just want to know why, and perhaps it's the response literature, is that he, after he knew that he sent people to his death and signed all of this, and he knew obviously that one shouldn't kill people, he goes to the camp, sees people killed, and suddenly realizes that this somehow affects him. We don't even know whether he thinks it's morally wrong, because he goes back to Berlin, I suppose, and says, that's perhaps not the right solution. But it doesn't mean that he says we do something morally wrong, which you say also in the interview he never admitted that. But why would that moment be so important? I mean, yeah, so hopefully he now realized that he was all the time morally responsible, but if he hadn't felt that, he would still be morally responsible, I think. I mean, I say, yeah, that's even worse, right? He is also morally responsible for not even feeling it. So to give you an example, if somebody drinks alcohol and then does something really stupid, they can say, yeah, I was under the influence of alcohol. But in a way, they kind of got into the situation. So I think moral responsibility starts much earlier. So, and then it wouldn't be so important for explaining evil. So why did you put such, I would say, high threshold? I think you said Albert Speer is not morally responsible for what he did in...
No, I think Speer is definitely still morally responsible. I just think his evil is of a different type than Eichmann's, because what Speer did was he tried to close himself off, even though like he knew what was happening. He did hear reports about it. He just pretended he didn't really know. And in his memoir that he wrote years later, actually, and other research that has been done on him, it's become clear that Speer actually did know a lot more than he claimed to, at least when he was in prison and when he was put on trial in Nuremberg. And so I do think Speer is morally responsible. I think, yeah, what I'm getting at is a response to some literature that, and the way Eichmann was portrayed as somebody who didn't think for himself. And he said quite a few times in the trial, actually at the Wannsee conference when the final solution was announced, he saw Heimler and Hitler speak, and he said, well, who am I to judge? You know, I'm hearing these great people, the people he looked up to, speaking, and he thinks he can't make a judgment. And so I think that that's the point, is sort of how he was portrayed for so many years, was of somebody who didn't think for himself, of somebody who really just followed orders and whose moral system was aligned with what Hitler said was right, not with what he thought was right. And so, again, it's sort of that same perspective that he was maybe of such evil that he didn't actually understand moral norms like us rational people would.
I'll just follow up on this question, because I also want to ask about moral responsibility. I might have misread your slide. It's early in the paper, you want to say, look, there are those people who will excuse Eichmann by saying that he believed he was behaving morally by following Hitler. You're saying, no, I don't buy that. Let me show you his reactions when he went there. But you had a slide up there when he talks about if we could have killed 10 million Jews. Could you go to that slide? Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
I have no regrets. Every fiber in me resists that we did something wrong. That suggests that he didn't think he was doing anything wrong. And if he doesn't think he's doing anything wrong, that's a real problem for your account, right? So how do you make sense of this?
So the way I sort of make sense of this is that this was in 1957. And so Eichmann, it's now been 12, 13 years since the Holocaust, at least since the end of the war. And so when he was in Germany in 1941, he did have these feelings of moral responsibility. Maybe he didn't remember them as well in 1957, because at some point he did change. I agree. At some point his motives became evil. At some point he had no remorse. At some point he became somebody that said every fiber in me resists that we did something wrong. But this was, again, 12, 13 years later, and so if we go back and we really track all of Eichmann's actions and other things he said before the final solution and when it was first announced, we can see his, I don't want to say something like, not uneasiness, but his, he didn't like the final solution. He admitted that, not only to Mueller, to other people. He said that he didn't think it was the right course of action, that he was very uncomfortable with the directive of it. And so I think this is just a retrospective where he's talking to a Dutch Nazi sympathizer guy in Argentina, and he's, I don't want to say misremembering, but maybe trying to show up. And that's another thing about Eichmann. He was very, a lot of people and a lot of biographies and literature about him say he was very much somebody who tended to brag. And so I think that this is just an example of this. I think, here's this Nazi sympathizer person looking up to Eichmann, and Eichmann is of course trying to brag to him. So I think it's just more an example of his personality and an attempt to show that rather than a lack of moral responsibility.
Yeah, and the fact that it's so much later, which I was unaware of, I think is really good, great response. Just the second question is just about what you're ultimately up to in the paper. Toward the end of your comments here, I think you said something like, look, this is obviously unsatisfactory. This is not a solution that we all should be happy about or something like that. I quite agree with that. But that seems to me like a very different thing from showing that desert-based retributivism is itself inadequate or problematic. And it seems like that's part of your goal as well. So, in the abstract, you talk about structural faults with punishment, especially desert-based retributivism. And then as you go on later, you say desert-based retributivism disintegrates, right? So, let me give you this. Here's a defense of desert-based retributivism, which would say, let's say the principle is not people should receive the punishments they deserve. But it's this: people should receive the punishments they deserve, except in cases where competing moral considerations outweigh that presumption or something like that. So yes, he should, desert-based retributivism would say, yes, if not for the fact that torture is an utterly impermissible thing, this guy should be tortured, he deserves that. And we all say, yes, that's right. But given that torture does have this other nature, it should not, it in this case would not be the appropriate thing to do. So that's an attempt to preserve desert-based retributivism, or maybe I could put it better. I feel like you're making desert-based retributivism kind of absolute requirement, when instead we should see it as a sort of ceteris paribus type thing.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think part of that stems from the fact that when I actually set out to write the paper, I really tried to find a punishment that Eichmann deserved. And I personally was really unsatisfied with the fact that that everything I came up with was torture. And so I was left with either like torture him or like we can't do anything. And so I was really struggling to come up with something that worked for me. And so I do agree with you. I think that's a remnant of me personally really feeling like he does deserve punishment, and that's my intuition, but we can't do anything about it. And so that's what makes it so hard.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, thank you.
Okay, does anyone in the audience have a question they would like to ask?
So I'm Karen, I don't know anything about this, but desert-based retributivism sounds a lot like an eye for an eye. Could you explain how it's different, or is there more to it?
Yeah, so it is different than an eye for an eye. What we would consider to be an eye for an eye type of punishment is what we call forfeiture-based retributivism, and that has to be a lot more precise. And so, again, what an eye for an eye is looking for is like the exact correlation of punishment that would work. And so, obviously, again, that would also present a problem for Eichmann. The difference between desert is that it's more correlated to like the level and severity of what somebody deserves, so it doesn't necessarily have to be like the same exact thing that they did to somebody else. Because we feel like he should deserve to know how his actions affected people, a lot of that comes up, like maybe he deserved to be sentenced to hard labor or something, but it doesn't necessarily require something like that. Because what you just mentioned is considered forfeiture-based retributivism, and desert's a little different, because it can be something different, but again, Eichmann's level of desert is just so high that anything he deserves would be morally impermissible, regardless of what we can come up with. Like, maybe he deserves to have his fingernails pulled out for the rest of all time. Maybe he deserves, like, maybe he does deserve torture, but that is different than an eye for an eye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We can do one more very brief question if somebody else has. Okay, my question is brief, so I will force it in.